CBSE Board, Class 9, History, Chapter 1, Part 11, audio by Rini Matthew. We saw that slavery was becoming an increased problem all over the world, especially in the places like Europe, Africa and America. Slave trade began in the 17th century, and it was so pathetic to see people being transported across the Atlantic from different places, brought to the plantation of the colonizer. That was what was happening, and they were sold. First they were transported from the required place, and then they were sent to the plantations, and then again there also they were sold to the plantation owners. That was what was happening. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee and indigo. You should understand that these materials were very costly in those days. So slaves or people were really exploited. Manpower was exploited because there was a growing demand for all these materials in the European markets. There were port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owned their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. So without the slave trade, they're trying to say that nothing will be possible. The Europeans will never work on the plantation sites. It is always the people who were transported from the colonized areas. What the Britishers did was they used to go and colonize a place, and then they will transport the layman or the citizens of that place and bring them here. Especially Africa was prone to this, and even the Americas. So throughout the 18th century there was little criticism of slavery in France, so nobody was bothered about it exactly in the 18th century. And then we saw the formation of the National Assembly. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. So there was a big debate going on whether the right of man should be extended to all the French people, including the people inside the colonies. But it did not pass any law at all. It did not have any impact, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. So you should see that all these people were really powerful and nothing could be really done. Alright, so businessmen would oppose. So as a result of that, or fearing that, what happened? They just could do one thing, that is, just stay quiet without passing any law on this. It was finally the convention which in 1794, so you should remember that in the beginning it was the Estate General, then the National Assembly was formed, and after that the convention was formed. Convention in 1794 legislated to free all slaves. So only the convention was able to take a step in the case of slavery in the French overseas possessions. So I told you that people were transported from France to other places which required workers. So they decided to free all the people abroad. So people from France were taken, they were transported because they were colonized and they were working elsewhere. So all those people were freed. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. So it was not for a long term that they were free. They came back to their place and they were so happy. 10 years later, we saw that Napoleon reintroduced slavery. So he was such a great ruler, a great emperor, but he did so much of restrictions. He made so much of restrictions on law, and he was almost very similar to a dictator. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes. So African Negroes were affected badly, and plantation owners actually took so much of delight, and they got a lot of profit when the African Negroes were brought here in pursuit of their economic interest. So they were just exploited. Slavery was finally abolished in the French colonies in 1848. So finally there was a big change only in the 1848. The revolution and everyday life. So how did all these things impact? That is what we are going to see now. Look at the question which is given on top of the slide. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? So how does politics impact your daily life, your basic necessities, your needs? The years following 1789 in France saw much changes in the lives of men, women, and children. So we are going to see how it impacted. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws. So we saw that so many constitutions, so many formation came up, and all of them claimed that they will pass laws for the good of the people, which would translate the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They wanted all these things to be implemented in everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille. Do you remember 7,000 men and women storming into the Bastille in the summer of 1789? So what they really wanted was the abolition of censorship, because whatever was written in those days were censored. Let's see how it was censored. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, look at all the written material, forms of writing and cultural activities, things like books, newspapers, plays, because you should remember that people used to discuss around books and newspapers. Now it is not like that. Now we have a group who really reads and only they will discuss on the books. Reading has reduced so much these days. So in those days there was no other form of information. It was only books and newspapers, and people used to discuss about it in saloons and coffee shops. So these things could be published or performed. So based on reading, people used to perform. We didn't have any films then, we never had any other forms of entertainment. It was only drama, it was only stage plays and all that. Theatre was so prominent in those days. So it was published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. So the king will have a group of people, or he himself will go through it. He will go through the matter, the content, and then sometimes if it is not pleasing him, he will have it cut out. So it was based on the permission of the king that it was published. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. We saw that this particular movement wanted freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right which is given to all men in the nation. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. So you should remember that people used to run behind all these things to get news, to get hold of what is happening around France, in other parts of the world and all that. So people used to run after this, and it used to get circulated from the cities to the countryside, and they got information through it. So it had to be censored, it had to be curbed. That was the idea of the censors in those days. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. So much of views came up, so much of things like, my perception will be different from your perception. So writers expressed their viewpoints, they expressed their opinions through newspapers and books. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. So you know that a lot of clubs and a lot of groups were formed all over the nation, right? All over the country. They wanted to just reform their lifestyle. So each club or each group wanted to convince their side. And how did they do that? It was through these newspapers, plays and all that. Plays, songs, festive processions attracted large numbers of people. So if they ask you what are the forms, these are the forms: plays, songs, festive processions. Then what else? Print, newspapers, books. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in text, which only a handful of educated people could read. So people who were literate were able to read through these newspapers, the books and all that. But what about a majority who were not educated, who did not have access to education at all? That is what happened in clubs, saloons and coffee shops, where the educated people will help the others by reading it aloud. And after that, what they did was they used to perform it on stage through plays, in the form of play, in the form of song, in the form of festive processions. So everybody will be able to understand, everybody will be able to comprehend with it. That was the idea. Let's take a look at the conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. So he was a great emperor and he crowned himself. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries. So he not only conquered France but also neighboring countries, dispossessing dynasties. He just threw away kings from their thrones. He usurped the throne of other places also, and he created kingdoms where he placed members of his own family. So he was extending his kingdom, and that is why he is known as a great emperor. Alright, so it's not only in France, he did not limit himself to France, but he extended his empire to the other places where he kept his members of the family and gave them the power there. Napoleon saw his rule as a modernizer of Europe, so he himself thought that he was a great modernizer. A new era will be formed under him in Europe, not in France. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. So he of course said that private property will have to be protected, so that rule was imposed for the people. And then uniform system of weights and measures, the decimal system came into being under him. Till then it is like there was no proper standard measurement system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator. So many people thought that Napoleon will help us and he is a liberator. He was looked upon as a person who will act for the people without being so strict, without being so extreme, because people were tired of whom? Robespierre and all those people. So they thought that he will bring freedom for the people. But what happened after that, we have to see. So that is what tells us about the era of Napoleon Bonaparte. It's not how they expected. All right.